It was a day that seemed ordinary, a typical Tuesday morning with a gentle breeze carrying the sound of birds chirping outside the courthouse. But what happened inside those solemn walls would leave everyone who witnessed it speechless. In the center of it all was Emma, a small, timid girl with big, expressive brown eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. At just 10 years old, she was about to do something so powerful, so unexpected, that it would forever change the lives of those around her, and her family would never be the same. Emma wasn't your average child. Though shy and soft-spoken, she carried herself with a quiet strength that belied her years. Life had thrown challenges her way, challenges no child should ever have to endure. Yet here she was, standing tall, her tiny hands clutching the edges of a chair as she prepared to take the stand. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with curious onlookers, reporters, and family members. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your heart race even if you're just a bystander. Everyone in the room knew this wasn't just any case. It was a story of love and betrayal, of pain and resilience, and most importantly, of a little girl who held the power to unravel the truth. Emma's testimony wasn't just a formality. It was the key to everything. For weeks, whispers of what she might say had circulated like wildfire. Speculation, doubt, and even outright disbelief shadowed her. After all, how could someone so young possibly carry such a burden? The judge, a stern but kind-faced man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, leaned forward slightly as Emma climbed onto the stand. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every tiny sound, a cough, the shuffling of papers, feel amplified. Even the lawyers, who had been locked in battle for weeks, seemed to pause as they watched her. Emma's father sat on one side of the courtroom, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. His face was a mixture of worry and regret, emotions that seemed too raw to hide. On the other side was her mother, her expression unreadable but her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Between them sat years of unspoken words, unresolved conflicts, and the fragile thread of a family on the brink of collapse. And at the center of it all was Emma, holding on to a truth she had decided could no longer stay hidden. The moment she began to speak, her voice clear and unwavering, the room collectively held its breath. It wasn't just her words, but the way she said them, each syllable laced with a courage that seemed almost impossible for someone her age. Emma told her story not with anger, but with honesty. She spoke of moments no child should have to witness, of secrets kept in the name of protecting those she loved. She described the laughter that used to fill their home and how it had been replaced by whispers and tension, the kind of tension that even a child couldn't ignore. But just as she began to reveal the heart of her story, something extraordinary happened, something that no one in the room could have anticipated. Emma's words didn't just uncover the truth, they unlocked emotions, memories, and realizations that had been buried for years. Her bravery shone like a light cutting through the darkness, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the weight of everything, the trial, the accusations, the pain, shifted onto her small but capable shoulders. What Emma said next would change everything. It wasn't a confession, nor was it an accusation. It was something far deeper. It was the kind of truth that leaves you questioning everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and the bonds of family. As her final words hung in the air, the room erupted, not in noise, but in stunned silence. It was the kind of silence that only comes when something so profound, so earth-shattering, has just been revealed. And in that moment, Emma looked at the faces around her, some filled with shock, others with a newfound understanding, and realized the power of her voice. Little did she know, her brave words were only the beginning. What happened next would test the strength of her family and their ability to heal. But for now, one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same. As the echoes of Emma's final words settled into the heavy silence of the courtroom, it felt as though time itself had stopped. All eyes remained fixed on the little girl, who now sat still, her small frame looking even more delicate under the weight of what she had just revealed. The judge adjusted his glasses, his usual commanding presence softened by the raw emotion in the room. Lawyers exchanged glances, some leaning into hushed conversations, while others simply stared ahead, processing what had just unfolded. Emma's mother, seated at the far end of the room, seemed frozen. Her hands gripped the edge of her seat, her knuckles pale against her skin. She blinked rapidly as though trying to hold back tears that threatened to spill. Across from her, Emma's father shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes cast downward. It was hard to tell if his expression was one of guilt, sadness, or something in between. For weeks, the courtroom had been a battlefield, each side arguing their case with fierce determination. But now it seemed as though Emma's words had brought an unexpected pause, a moment of clarity that no one had seen coming. Outside the courthouse, the story was already making waves. Reporters crowded the steps, their cameras and microphones aimed at anyone who might offer a soundbite. Emma's case wasn't just another headline, it was personal, raw, and deeply human. The whispers of a broken family and the bravery of a child were the kind of stories that gripped people's hearts. Yet despite all the attention, the full truth remained elusive, shrouded in the layers of pain and secrets that had brought them all to this point. Emma's story had begun long before this day, in a small weathered house on the edge of town. It was a modest home with creaking floorboards and a garden that always seemed to be just a little overgrown. To an outsider, it might have looked like any other house on the block, ordinary, unremarkable. But inside, the walls carried the echoes of laughter, arguments, and moments that had shaped Emma's young life. Her parents, Sarah and Mark, had once been the kind of couple that people admired. Sarah was a warm and spirited woman with a knack for making even the simplest moments feel special. Mark was quieter, more reserved, but deeply devoted to his family. Together, they had built a life that, while far from perfect, had been filled with love. For years, they had weathered life's ups and downs, leaning on each other through challenges that might have broken others. But somewhere along the way, cracks had begun to form, small at first, barely noticeable, but growing deeper, with time. Emma had always been perceptive, a trait that sometimes made her seem older than her years. She noticed the little things, the way her parents' conversations became shorter, their laughter less frequent. She saw the way her father's eyes seemed to linger on the ground, as though avoiding something he couldn't bear to face. And she felt the tension in the air, the kind that made her stomach twist in knots even when no one said a word. It wasn't until one rainy evening, months before the trial, that Emma had truly understood how much her family had changed. She had been sitting at the kitchen table, coloring in a picture of a sunflower, when she overheard her parents arguing in the next room. Their voices, usually calm and measured, were sharp and filled with emotion. At first, she tried to block it out, focusing on her drawing, but the words kept slipping through. "You're not listening to me, Mark." Her mother's voice trembled, a mixture of frustration and hurt. "I've been trying to tell you for months, but you shut me out." "I'm not shutting you out," her father replied, his tone defensive. "I'm trying to keep things together. For Emma. For us." "But at what cost?" Sarah's voice cracked, and Emma could hear the tears in it. "We're not the same anymore. You're not the same." Emma had felt her chest tighten, her crayons forgotten as she strained to hear more. She didn't understand everything they were saying, but the pain in their voices was unmistakable. It was in that moment that she realized the cracks in their family weren't just in her imagination. They were real and they were growing. Over the weeks that followed, the arguments became more frequent, their voices carrying through the thin walls of the house. Sometimes they tried to hide it, lowering their voices when Emma was around, but she always knew. Children have a way of sensing things, of picking up on emotions even when the words don't match. And Emma, with her quiet observation and sensitive heart, felt every unspoken word as if it were her own. The day her parents announced they were separating was one Emma would never forget. It had been a sunny afternoon, the kind of day that felt too bright for bad news. They had sat her down on the worn-out couch in the living room, their faces a mixture of sadness and determination. Her mother had taken her hand, while her father sat on the edge of his seat, his hands clasped tightly together. "Emma," her mother began, her voice gentle but firm, "your dad and we've decided that it's best if we spend some time apart." Emma's heart sank, the words hitting her like a weight in her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her father cleared his throat, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in what felt like weeks. "It means that we love you very much, but we think it's better for us to live in different places, for a while." The explanation had been simple, but the reality was anything but. Suddenly her world was divided. Weekdays with her mom, weekends with her dad. The house that had once been filled with the sounds of family dinners and movie nights was now quieter, emptier, and while both her parents tried their best to make things feel normal, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that nothing ever would be again. It was during this time that Emma began to notice things that didn't add up, things that made her question the story she had been told. Late-night phone calls that ended abruptly when she walked into the room. Conversations that stopped the moment she entered. And most of all, the way her parents seemed to avoid each other. Even during the brief exchanges when they dropped her off or picked her up, Emma wasn't sure what to do with the questions swirling in her mind. She wanted to believe her parents, to trust that they were doing what was best for her. But the nagging feeling in her chest wouldn't go away. It wasn't until one night, lying awake in her bed, that she made a decision. She was tired of feeling like a bystander in her own life, of watching her family unravel without understanding why. She decided she would find out the truth no matter what it took. What Emma discovered in the weeks that followed would lead her to that courtroom, standing before a room full of strangers, her voice shaking but resolute. The journey wasn't easy, and the truth she uncovered was far more complicated than she could have imagined. But Emma knew one thing for sure. If there was any chance of saving her family, it started with her. The courtroom was still, but Emma's mind raced as she sat on the stand, her small hands gripping the edge of her chair. She had never imagined her life would lead her here, in front of so many strangers with her family's pain laid bare for the world to see. The eyes on her felt heavy, each one waiting for her next word, her next revelation. But as she sat there, she thought back to the moments that had brought her to this point. Emma had found it one afternoon while searching for her sketchpad in the cluttered corner of her mother's home office. At first glance, it looked ordinary, its plain black cover worn and scratched. But when she opened it, she realized it wasn't just any notebook, it was a diary. Her mother's handwriting filled the pages, looping and slanting with emotion. Emma knew she shouldn't read it, but curiosity tugged at her, and before she could stop herself, she was flipping through the entries. What she found wasn't what she expected. There were no secrets, no shocking confessions. Instead, the pages were filled with thoughts and feelings, some happy, others tinged with sadness. But one line stood out, scrawled hastily in the margin of a page. "He thinks I don't know, but I do. How could he do this to us?" Emma didn't understand what it meant, but the words stayed with her, gnawing at the edges of her mind. Who was her mother talking about? And what had he done? She thought about asking her mother, but hesitated. Sarah had been different. Lately, quieter, more distant. She still smiled and hugged Emma, but there was something behind her eyes that Emma couldn't quite figure out. Instead, she decided to wait, to watch and listen, hoping the answers would come to her. And eventually they did. One weekend, while staying at her father's new apartment, Emma overheard a phone call. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the walls were thin, and Mark's voice carried easily into her room. He was talking to someone. A woman by the sound of it. And though Emma couldn't hear every word, the tone of the conversation was enough to make her uneasy. Her father sounded frustrated, his voice rising and falling in a way she hadn't heard before. And the woman on the other end? She sounded close. Too close. The next morning, Emma asked her father about the call, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who were you talking to last night?" she asked, trying to sound casual. But Mark's reaction told her everything she needed to know. His face flushed, and he stumbled over his words, finally settling on, "Just a work call, sweetheart. Nothing important." Emma wanted to believe him, but the pit in her stomach told her otherwise. She didn't say anything more, but she started paying closer attention. She noticed the way her father's phone always seemed to be face down on the table, how he stepped out of the room to take certain calls, and how his explanations always seemed just a little too rehearsed. As the weeks went on, Emma began to see the cracks more clearly. Her father wasn't just keeping secrets, he was hiding something big. And her mother? She knew. The tension between them wasn't just about the separation, it was about something deeper, something neither of them wanted to admit. Emma didn't know what to do with this knowledge. She was just a kid, caught in the middle of a situation that felt far too big for her to handle, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth needed to come out. It was around this time that Emma's school counselor, Ms. Carter, started noticing the changes in her. Emma had always been quiet, but now she seemed withdrawn, her usual spark dimmed. One afternoon, Ms. Carter pulled her aside after class, her voice gentle but firm. "Emma, is everything okay at home?" she asked, her eyes searching Emma's face for answers. At first, Emma didn't know what to say. She didn't want to get her parents in trouble or make things worse, but something about Ms. Carter's kind eyes and patient smile made her feel safe. "So," she told her. "Not everything, but enough. About the arguments, the secrets, the feeling that her family was falling apart." Ms. Carter listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally as Emma poured her heart out. When she was done, Ms. Carter took her hand and said, "You're very brave, Emma, and it's okay to feel scared. But sometimes the only way to fix something is to face it head on." Those words stuck with Emma in the days that followed. She didn't know how to fix her family, but she knew she couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. So she started gathering pieces of the puzzle, trying to make sense of the situation. She asked questions, sometimes directly, other times subtly. She paid attention to the things her parents said and the things they didn't, and slowly but surely a picture began to form. It wasn't until Emma's mother filed for custody that everything came to a head. The court case had been messy from the start, with both parents making their arguments and airing grievances that cut deep. Emma hated every second of it, the way the lawyers talked about her like she wasn't in the room, the way her parents avoided each other's eyes, and the way the whole process felt like a battle she never asked to be part of. But through it all, Emma kept her focus. She knew the truth, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it came out. And when the day finally came for her to testify, she felt a mixture of fear and determination. She didn't want to hurt anyone, least of all her parents. But she also knew that hiding the truth wouldn't make things better. As she took the stand and looked out at the sea of faces, she felt a lump form in her throat. Her father sat to her left, his face pale and drawn. Her mother was on the right, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Both of them looked at Emma with a mixture of love and desperation, as if hoping she would somehow make everything okay. But Emma knew she couldn't. All she could do was tell the truth and hope it would be enough. And so she spoke. She told the court about the arguments, the secrets, and the phone calls she wasn't supposed to hear. She talked about the notebook, and the nights she spent lying awake, wondering if her family would ever feel whole again. And as she spoke, she saw the emotions play out on her parents' faces: shock, sadness, regret. But it wasn't just them. The entire courtroom seemed to hang on her every word, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. By the time she finished, the silence was deafening, a heavy stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, just as Emma thought she couldn't bear it any longer, the judge leaned forward, his voice breaking the silence. "Thank you, Emma," he said, his tone gentle. "You've shown a great deal of courage today." Emma nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done what she came to do, but the story wasn't over, not yet. The truth was out, but the path forward was still unclear. And as she stepped down from the stand, her parents' eyes meeting hers for the first time in what felt like forever, she couldn't help but wonder, was the truth enough to bring them back together, or had it come too late? As Emma stepped down from the stand, The weight of her words lingered in the air. She could feel the room buzzing with unspoken emotions, the silence thick with tension. Every step she took back to her seat felt heavier, as though she was carrying the burden of the truth she had just shared. Her small hands trembled as she gripped the wooden armrest of her chair, her gaze fixed on the floor to avoid the countless pairs of eyes now glued to her. She could feel the raw energy in the courtroom, a mix of shock, sadness, and something else she couldn't quite name. Her parents sat on opposite sides of the room, and for a brief moment, Emma dared to look at them. Her mother's face was pale, her eyes glassy as if she was on the verge of tears but trying to hold them back. She looked tired of the arguments, the uncertainty, and perhaps even the years of silence that had built up between them. Her father, on the other hand, wore an expression Emma had never seen before. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched into fists on the table in front of him, but his eyes looked hurt. Not angry, not defensive, just hurt. Emma wondered if either of them truly realized what their choices had done to her. She wasn't angry at them, not exactly. She understood, even in her young way, that adults made mistakes, that sometimes life didn't go the way people planned. But what she didn't understand was why they had to pull her into the middle of it all. She felt like a pawn in a game too big for her to play, and the thought made her stomach twist. The judge called for a brief recess, giving everyone a chance to gather themselves before the proceedings continued. As people shuffled out of the room, the tension seemed to follow them like an invisible cloud. Emma stayed in her seat, her hands gripping her knees as she stared straight ahead. She didn't want to talk to anyone, not even her lawyer or the kind social worker who had been assigned to her case. She just wanted to sit in the quiet and try to breathe. But the quiet didn't last long. Her father approached her first, kneeling beside her chair with an awkward hesitance that made Emma's heart ache. "Emma," he began, his voice soft and uneven. I'm sorry. For everything. I never wanted you to feel like this." His words were heavy with regret, but Emma couldn't bring herself to respond. She just nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor as her father's hand lingered on the armrest for a moment, before he stood and walked away. Her mother came next, sitting down beside her and wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You were so brave up there," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart." Emma turned to look at her mother, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw something in her eyes that looked like hope. It was faint, barely there, but it was enough to make Emma's chest tighten with a mix of emotions she couldn't name. The break ended, and everyone filed back into the courtroom, the weight of what was coming next hanging over them like a storm cloud. Emma's testimony had shifted something. She could feel it. The lawyers seemed more tense now, their voices sharper as they presented their closing arguments. They went back and forth, their words weaving a narrative that was both compelling and painful to hear. Emma felt like she was being torn in two, each side pulling her in a different direction as they tried to make their case. Her father's lawyer focused on his dedication to providing stability, emphasizing how much he loved Emma and wanted to be a part of her life. Her mother's lawyer painted a picture of resilience, highlighting the sacrifices Sarah had made to keep their family afloat during difficult times. Both arguments were strong, and Emma could see the strain on her parents' faces as they listened. But beneath all the legal jargon and polished rhetoric, Emma knew the truth wasn't as black and white as they made it seem. Her family's story was messy, complicated, and filled with shades of gray. As the judge began to speak, the room fell into a hushed silence. His voice was steady and deliberate, each word carrying the weight of the decision he was about to make. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her hands clutching the fabric of her dress as she listened. She knew this moment would change everything, but she couldn't predict how. The uncertainty was suffocating, and she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she fought to stay composed. The judge paused, his gaze sweeping across the room before settling on Emma. "This is not an easy decision," he said, his tone measured and firm. "It is clear that both parents care deeply for their daughter and want what is best for her. However, it is also clear that the family has been deeply affected by the events leading up to this case. My responsibility is to act in the best interest of the child, taking into account all the evidence presented. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the judge continued. She could feel the tension in the room rising, each word bringing them closer to the moment they had all been waiting for. Her parents sat stiffly at their respective tables, their faces unreadable but their emotions palpable. The air felt charged, like the seconds before a thunderstorm, and Emma could feel her heart pounding louder with each passing moment. The judge's next words would shape the rest of her life, and as he leaned forward to deliver his ruling, Emma closed her eyes, bracing herself for what was to come. The judge's voice broke through the tense silence, steady but weighted with finality. "Before I render my decision," he said, "there is one additional matter that needs to be addressed." His words hung in the air, heavy with a significance that no one had anticipated. Emma's eyes shot open, and a murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the lawyers exchanged surprised glances, their carefully prepared arguments momentarily forgotten. The judge turned his gaze toward a man seated at the back of the courtroom, someone Emma hadn't noticed before. He was older, with salt and pepper hair and a sharp suit that seemed out of place amidst the emotional chaos of the trial. The man stood as the judge gestured toward him, adjusting his tie with a calm confidence that only deepened the mystery. "Mr. Harper," the judge said, addressing the man directly, "please approach the bench." Emma's heart sank as confusion swept through her. Who was this man? And why was the judge addressing him so suddenly? Her mother's face went pale, her lips parting in what looked like disbelief. Her father stiffened in his seat, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the table. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the man stepped forward, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The judge leaned forward, his expression serious. "Mr. Harper has brought new information to the court's attention," he said, his voice measured. "Information that may have significant implications for this case." Emma's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She glanced at her mother, whose hands were trembling as she clutched a tissue to her mouth. Her father looked equally shaken, his usual calm exterior replaced by a tension that made Emma's stomach churn. Whatever this was, it was big, bigger than anything she could have imagined. Mr. Harper cleared his throat, his voice steady as he began to speak. "Your Honor," he said, "I represent a client who has asked to remain anonymous at this time. However, this client has direct knowledge of financial discrepancies and potential misconduct that may have contributed to the circumstances surrounding this case." The room erupted into murmurs, the tension in the air now electric. The judge raised a hand, calling for silence, but the damage was done. Emma's father shot a glance at her mother, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite read. Fear? Anger? Regret? Her mother avoided his gaze, her face crumpling under the weight of whatever had just been revealed. The judge nodded for Mr. Harper to continue, his tone growing sharper. "This court has reviewed documentation provided by Mr. Harper's client, which alleges that significant sums of money were withdrawn from joint accounts during the final months of the marriage. Additionally, there are claims of assets being concealed to avoid legal repercussions." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. These allegations raise serious questions about the transparency and honesty of both parties. Emma's mind spun as she tried to process what she was hearing. Money? Assets? She had no idea what any of it meant, but it was clear that this new development had changed everything. She looked to her parents for answers, but neither of them seemed capable of meeting her gaze. Her father looked stunned, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for the right words. Her mother sat frozen, her face a mask of shock and dismay. The judge called for order, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Given the gravity of these new allegations," he said, "it is imperative that we fully investigate their validity. This court will reconvene at a later date to address these claims in detail. For now, we will proceed with the matter of custody. But this new information will undoubtedly factor into future proceedings." Emma felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. The hearing was supposed to bring clarity, to provide answers and a sense of direction. Instead, it had only added to the confusion, raising questions she didn't even know to ask. She glanced around the room, searching for some sign of reassurance, but all she saw were faces etched with shock and uncertainty. The rest of the hearing passed in a blur, the weight of the new revelations casting a shadow over everything. Emma could barely focus on the words being spoken, her mind too preoccupied with the implications of what had just happened. Her parents were no longer just fighting over custody. They were tangled in a web of secrets and lies that threatened to unravel everything. As the judge prepared to announce his decision, Emma braced herself for the inevitable. But before he could speak, her father stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Your Honor," he said, his voice trembling, "I need to say something." The room fell silent once more as all eyes turned to him. He hesitated, glancing at Emma before turning back to the judge. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I've let my anger and pride get in the way of what's truly important. But I swear I've always had my daughter's best interests at heart." Emma's mother looked away, tears streaming down her face as her father continued. "I can't speak to these new allegations. I don't even know what they're about. But what I do know is that I love my daughter, and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." The judge studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Your statement will be taken into consideration." He turned to address the court once more, his expression unreadable. "Given the complexities of this case, I will need additional time to review the evidence and determine the best course of action." With that, the hearing was adjourned, leaving Emma and her family in a limbo that felt both unbearable and unavoidable. As they filed out of the courtroom, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The truth had been dragged into the light, but it had only raised more questions. And as she walked past the mysterious Mr. Harper, his sharp eyes briefly meeting hers, she couldn't help but wonder, what else was hiding in the shadows, waiting to be revealed? The next hearing came faster than Emma expected, though each day leading up to it felt like an eternity. Her parents barely spoke to each other, and when they did, the words were sharp and brittle, like glass that could shatter at any moment. Emma spent most of her time with her aunt, who tried her best to shield her from the tension, but even she couldn't hide the worried look she exchanged with Sarah or the hushed phone calls late at night. The weight of the unknown hung over them all, and Emma, caught in the middle, felt like she was suffocating under it. When the day finally arrived, the courtroom felt different, heavier somehow, like everyone knew this was the moment that would define everything. The judge entered, his expression stern and focused, and the room fell into silence. Emma sat between her lawyer and the social worker, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she tried to steady her breathing. She wasn't sure what she hoped for anymore. She just wanted the fighting to stop. The proceedings began with the judge addressing the allegations brought forward by Mr. Harper. His client, who remained anonymous, had provided extensive documentation that painted a troubling picture. The withdrawals, the hidden accounts, it all pointed to someone deliberately concealing resources. The judge's tone was careful, but the implications were clear. Someone in this courtroom wasn't telling the truth. Emma glanced nervously between her parents, trying to read their faces. Her father looked pale, his usual confidence replaced by a nervous energy that made him fidget in his seat. Her mother, meanwhile, stared straight ahead, her jaw tight and her hands clenched on the table in front of her. The tension between them was palpable, and Emma could feel it pressing down on her like a physical weight. Then, just as the judge was about to continue, Emma's mother stood up. The room froze, all eyes turning to her as she took a deep breath and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but strained, "I need to say something I should have said a long time ago." The judge raised an eyebrow, motioning for her to proceed. Sarah turned to Emma's father, her expression softening in a way Emma hadn't seen in years. "I've been angry for so long," she began, her voice trembling. "Angry at you, at the situation, at everything. But the truth is I made mistakes too. I wasn't honest about the money. I thought I was protecting Emma, but all I did was make things worse." A gasp rippled through the courtroom as Sarah's words sank in. Emma's father stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the floor. "The withdrawals, the hidden accounts, it was me. I was scared you'd fight for full custody, and I thought if I had the financial advantage, I could make sure Emma stayed with me. But it was wrong. All of it was wrong." Emma felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Her mother's confession was like a bomb going off, shattering the fragile stability they had left. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her mother, the one she had always trusted, had been hiding something so big, so important. It felt like the ground beneath her was crumbling, and she didn't know how to hold on. The judge's voice cut through the silence, calm but firm. "Mrs. Anderson, your honesty is appreciated, but these actions are serious. They have consequences not just for you, but for your daughter as well." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know," she whispered. "I'll accept whatever the court decides. I just couldn't keep lying, not anymore." Emma's father looked at Sarah, his expression a mix of anger, hurt, and something else. Relief, maybe? He shook his head, running a hand through his hair as he processed what had just happened. "I can't believe you'd do that," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "But I guess I wasn't perfect either. I let my pride get in the way. I should have listened more, fought less." For the first time in what felt like forever, Emma saw a glimmer of understanding between her parents. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. And in that moment she felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The judge took a deep breath, his expression softening as he looked at Emma. "This case has been difficult, but one thing is clear. Emma needs stability, honesty, and love from both of her parents. My decision is to grant joint custody with specific provisions to ensure that both parties are held accountable." Emma's heart lifted and sank at the same time. Joint custody meant she would have to split her time between her parents, but it also meant she wouldn't lose either of them entirely. It wasn't a perfect solution, but maybe it was the best they could hope for. As the hearing came to a close, the judge added one final note. "There is one more matter to address. The anonymous client who provided the financial documentation wished to remain unnamed, but I believe their identity should be revealed to the parties involved." The room held its breath as the judge motioned for Mr. Harper to speak. The lawyer stood, his face calm and composed as he delivered the final twist. "The client," he said, his voice steady, "is Emma's grandmother." Emma's eyes widened in shock. Her grandmother had passed away years ago, or so she had been told. But Mr. Harper clarified quickly, explaining that her maternal grandmother had left behind a series of letters and financial records detailing her concerns about the family's situation. The documents had only recently come to light, prompting the investigation. The revelation left everyone stunned, but for Emma, it was strangely comforting. It was as if her grandmother had reached out from beyond to guide them toward the truth, to remind them of the importance of honesty and family. And in that moment, Emma felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. As the courtroom emptied and her parents exchanged hesitant but hopeful glances, Emma walked out into the sunlight, feeling lighter than she had in months. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time it felt like they were finally moving toward something better, together.